Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
And I'm Hannah Broderud, and I'm excited to be once again recording from my home state of Montana. We're in Bozeman today, and our guest today is pretty impressive, Bella Butler. She manages the editorial team for Outlaw Publishing, which is one of the companies under the umbrella of Outlaw Partners. We recently interviewed Eric Ladd, the founder of Outlaw, on our podcast. So if you had a chance to listen to that episode, it's a good one to catch up on all the things that Outlaw is doing today. But one of the core businesses for Outlaw is a publishing arm. And so, Bella, would you share with us a little bit about your role and kind of the structure of Outlaw Publishing and what you guys, some of the projects you have?
Sure, yeah. We have a relatively small newsroom. We share an office with the whole company, and so it's really collaborative, but within our department, there's 5 of us. So we have an editor-in-chief, I'm the managing editor, and then we have an associate editor and a digital producer right now. And we are looking to bring on a staff writer.
Yeah, so if you are a journalism major who's graduating college, or you have some experience and you want to live in a beautiful resort town and write for a really heart-centered, community-oriented publication, reach out to Bella.
Yeah, we're looking for you.
Let's just get that plug out of the way.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, Bella, tell us a little bit about what made you, and so just for context, you're a pretty recent college grad yourself. So you're new in your career, you're a new leader, and you got your degree in journalism from University of Oklahoma.
Montana, yeah.
University of Montana. And sorry, I'm sitting here with Luke, my colleague from Oklahoma. University of Montana in Missoula, just about a year ago. And you've been doing some really cool stuff since then. And I've enjoyed reading your writing and kind of just following your career growth over the past year. But what led you to where you are today? What made you interested in journalism and specifically working in Big Sky where you grew up?
Yeah. I think I've always had a passion for writing. And when I was younger, my only understanding of what writing could look like was fiction. And so I was a big reader as a kid, started probably 20 novels when I was like 13 and never got past page 5 on any of them. And I think this is a very cliche journalism student story, but the first time I ever picked up a National Geographic when I was in high school, I remember I had a Spanish teacher that had a whole collection in his classroom. And I remember holding it. There was a picture of oceans on the cover and flipping through and thinking, wow, these are real stories. Yeah. That's really exciting. You can do that. Yeah. And so I think my interest shifted a little bit in that writing context to I think at the heart of that writing, it was always about story. Yeah. And really started to cultivate a passion for telling real stories.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. And so you chose, and I know I'm sure you had opportunities to go elsewhere and practice, writing journalism in other places. What made you choose to come back to Big Sky, your hometown?
Yeah. I've always loved Big Sky. I grew up there my whole life. Never left Montana. And I don't think I ever really had the intention of coming back. And I think, like a lot of stories these days, COVID kind of flipped that for me a little bit.
Yeah.
So in the spring of 2020, school shut down. We went all online. It felt natural to be at home with family. And so that March, I packed up all my things from Missoula, kept doing school online, and moved back to Big Sky. And during that time, I had previously interned for Outlaw Partners with the editorial department and had done, a lot of intern things and learned to write at a very kind of early stage of my journalism education there. And so they were also in a really interesting space at that time, just right when the pandemic hit, with a lot of uncertainty on how to continue that business, especially with events being roped into that.
Yeah.
And the team shrunk quite a bit in a pretty short period of time. So my boss now, Joe O'Connor, the editor-in-chief of our publications and the VP of media for the company, got in touch with me, and I was still in school at this time. Yeah. So I always joke at the time I was probably cheap labor, and said, would you like to do a little bit of work for us? Yeah. And so it started as a few stories here and there while I was still in school, and then kind of evolved into a part and then more full-time position during that first COVID year. Yeah. And that was, a really organic opportunity that came out of the pandemic circumstances. And I think during that time, the concept of connection and community became really important. Yeah. And it started on that smaller level, being with my family, I think, during that really tumultuous time, and then moving into, the comfort and security of that community connection during a lot of that adversity. And in that role, in telling stories of that community during that time, it felt like that was a really great way, not only to tap into that connection myself, but to give other people an avenue for that. So I didn't realize, how important a lot of that was until it was gone during that time. And so
that's awesome.
Yeah, it just kind of became a tool for that.
Yeah. And we talk a lot about the importance of meaningful work, of connection, community on this podcast. And so all of those themes, right? Those are things that when we work with organizations, things that we know both from experience and from science that are really, really important for people. We're called Purpose and Performance Group because we believe that purpose elevates performance, and we get better performance outcomes when people feel like they have purpose, personally and at work. And if they can connect their personal purpose with their work purpose, that's even stronger, right? And then creating meaningful connection with people is what makes us all thrive. It's one of the most core basic human needs, right? Is that need for connection and belonging and love. And if we can create workspaces where we can, people get those needs met, I think we're going to have stronger outcomes. And we see that both in the people we work with and there's science to back that up.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and I'm going to give some context first. So Big Sky is kind of a boom town, right? So it's been growing really rapidly. Didn't have a local news publication until your publication, was founded, whatever year that was. So I'm curious, as you kind of fill this function of creating connection in the community, how do you choose what stories to elevate, what stories to pass on maybe, and maybe even what tone you want to take as you're sharing stories and trying to build connection?
Yeah, that's a huge conversation that never stops in our newsroom. And I think one of the really core original tenets of journalism is objectivity. And I think that term in the sort of journalism ethics space is starting to be redefined a little bit. So it's still important, but it doesn't necessarily have to look like neutrality. And so where a lot of that editorial choice comes in is exactly what you're talking about. What stories are we telling and how do we tell them? Whose voices do we lift up to tell those stories? And it's never easy. And I think a lot of it, we talk about news sense, and a lot of it comes down to intuition. And a lot of that intuition comes from awareness and integration. And so a big part of any storytelling, especially in a small community like Big Sky, that has a lot of really unique challenges and benefits is being really tapped into that place and having a really strong sense of place and understanding people's sense of place that's different from yours too. So spending a lot of time with different groups in the community and being involved kind of in that on the fly on the wall space too, as a journalist, and making connections and building relationships and building trust and creating that sort of network of connection, back to the connection too, allows you to establish that new sense and that intuition. And I think that really drives a lot of those editorial decisions when we are looking at, who do we look to help us tell these stories. And sometimes it is a little bit more black and white. We report on, Big Sky's Unincorporated, which is a really unique thing to focus on as a journalist and as a reporter. So we have the organizational structure is sort of a big web, and there's several special districts, nonprofits, volunteer organizations, and that's sort of what makes the town run. And so we have hands in all of this, and we're ears in every space and every corner of that. And so we know the people in all of those corners and all of those pockets of Big Sky. And we have go-tos, and we have people that we trust and sources that we trust. And we have, pockets of information beneath all of those people that we can use to check all of those sources of information. So a lot of it is just that investment and tapping into those different parts of the community to inform that intuition.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about maybe a story that stands out where you felt like you were doing something that mattered and that had a positive impact on the community or on the lives of an individual, in the community.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. There's so many good ones. Makes me feel full just thinking about them, actually. I think I've been thinking about a lot of these stories recently. We have sort of a shoulder season in Big Sky, and a lot of those, thousands of tourists rush out, and we just have a little bit of breathing room you're going out to restaurants and people that are sitting next to you at the table, and it feels a little bit more like home. And I've gotten to tell some stories recently that tap into that feeling, that local connection, and what Big Sky always felt like to me growing up, which is a little bit different now, not always a bad thing. And so top of mind, I recently got to write a story about an event that a friend hosted. It was the fourth year that he did it. It's a snowboard race in the backcountry. So on its face, just really fun, kind of rowdy end of season event. And he's really used it to cultivate a very specific part of the Big Sky community and to give people space to feel recognized, to feel heard. He's kind of wrapped this mental health component around it. They do a lap for the lost at the end of the event, where he talks about, the importance of being there for each other and then showing up for yourself. And so I attended that event just a few weeks ago, and got to write about that and included, voices of people who are there who are feeling really touched by that space. And I think there are a lot of stories that I've gotten to tell in Big Sky like that have really been super fulfilling for me to give people that opportunity to share their sense of place and what that community is to them. And also give other people who aren't necessarily a part of that a door and a window into that. And so I think what's really cool about those stories, and I've gotten to tell a lot, that's just one example, is that for me, it's work. A lot of news, I always have been taught that news is a service. And so providing information is a way of contributing to communities. And I believe that wholeheartedly. And it can feel really draining sometimes, where they're really late, often digging into, really tiny details and fact checking. And sometimes it's really dry and it's important, but it's not the most thrilling story. And that is important and it's a contribution, but it doesn't always kind of fill you back up. And so I've been really thinking about that lately and really honoring the stories that we do get to tell that are not only a contribution, but you're getting something back in and you're sort of filling your cup back up to go tell more stories like that.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's such a important. I'm glad you're thinking about that, because that's, I think, one of the things that are really important for leaders. We've talked about it several times on the podcast of how when we're in roles where we're always giving out, right? And as a leader, you're there for the work, surely, but you're there for the people, right? And we do a lot of the kind of work where we're really present with people. And it is, for me, it's energizing in the moment and I feed on the connection, but it's also very, very draining. And because you're always giving energy out, right? And so I think it's such an important leadership practice to be mindful of, how do I recharge my batteries? If I'm going to be someone that others can depend on, if I'm going to be someone that has a positive impact on my world and on other people's lives, and I'm going to perform at a certain level, and I have high standards, what do I need to do to resource myself to be the best version of me so I can operate at that level over time? And we had a awesome conversation with another person who, if you don't know her, you should meet her, Lorca Smetana, who is in Bozeman. She's a resilience researcher and teacher. And she talks about, how do we build resilience for ourselves and how do we build resilience into the systems that we work in. And part of that is what you were just talking about, right? What is it that fills my cup? What is it that not only re-energizes, or, like if you think about running, for example, you got to recover, right? And part of training for a race is recovery. Like, you're not just running and running and running. When you're training, you take the recovery really seriously. That's part of the training. And so building in those recovery practices that are not just recovering you back to, square one, but that are rejuvenating and re-energizing, that create energy, right? So we have to have an engine that creates energy so we have more energy to give out.
Yeah, that's so important. And it's one of the hardest things to do.
Yeah.
I think that's, for me, has been a place where I've had a really hard time bridging concept and application. And so right before last year, actually just a year ago when I left school, I got to wrap up. I've been a part of different leadership programs my whole life, and that's sort of an area where I've naturally been funneled into and have been given a lot of opportunities to learn at a really conceptual level. Excuse me. And so I got the opportunity sort of at the end of that to help teach a class on leadership theory for younger students. And that was something that we talked about in every lesson plan, in every context, was none of this matters if you can't take care of yourself. You can't provide any of this. You can't lead. You can't contribute to your group or team or whatever it is if you're not fully able to be present and to show up. And so I said that a million times over the course of 4 months. And then being in this position now, having that application, I'm not finding that so naturally. And so it's something that I know on a very conceptual level is so important. And it's so hard to tap into that.
It is.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I was going to ask you next is, I would love to hear about that transition into a leadership role and what have been some of the kind of lessons learned or takeaways that you're like, oh, no one told me this, or they told me it, but I didn't really know how to apply it. Oftentimes we hear about like, well, yeah, I knew I was going to have to spend some sort of time on supervision, coaching, whatever, but like, I didn't know it was going to be like 8 hours a week. So I'm curious.
Or I didn't know that people are that hard to work with.
Yeah. Yeah. Real people are way harder than people in textbooks.
Yes, they are.
They're way more fun to spend time with too.
That's true.
Yeah. There's been a lot on kind of both sides of that. I think the biggest thing, top of mind, that's been my biggest journey this year, has been learning that I can't be everything for everyone. And I think that was both something that, I did hear and something that I had to learn. And I think in adapting the way that I lead and the way that I approach my relationships with my team members to that reality has made me so much of a better leader. And I think that's created so much more potential for the way that I lead my team. But right off the bat, it was like, I need to be everything for everyone. So I need to be your friend. I need to be your support system. I need to be your supervisor. I need to be your editor. And I need to be all of the things that make up all those roles. And I think it's been really effective for me to take a step back and take a breath from the super fast-paced environment that I'm working in and say, okay, I'm actually not the most organized person. That's not one of my strengths. And I have lots of people on my team who are really good at that. And so I'm going to really lean in to the areas where I'm really strong, to building relationships, to offering criticism, and to growing and building our team, and lean on other folks who can help me and support me in the organizational space and other areas where I'm not so strong. And I think I'm still learning that. But I think that's been one of the key things. And it's changed the way that I'm approaching my work a lot.
Yeah.
Have you found, and I'm asking just curiously because I experienced this, have you found that, often we imagine like what kind of, when we're in our early jobs and we have different supervisors, and sometimes we maybe had a great leader that we learned a lot from. And then maybe more often than not, we had a manager or somebody that just wasn't a good leader, or at least wasn't a good fit for us. And, we kept thinking, man, I'm definitely learning what not to do. And if I'm ever a leader, or when I'm a leader, or when I'm responsible for managing people or a team, I'm going to be the kind of leader that I wish that I had. And then what happened in my case was I had this idea of what kind of manager I wanted. And that's how I was leading, because it's what I needed. And I assumed that, I'm being a good boss, I'm being a good leader because I'm giving people what I wish that I would have had. And then it turned out that, for some team members, that was right and that was a good fit and it was helpful for them. For other team members, it wasn't, because they needed something different. Have you gone through that experience at all? And if so, can you share a little bit about it?
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. And that's been another learning curve, I think, in, that transition from concept to practice. And I think the details within that is, what I expect of the people that I'm leading. And it's because I'm expecting of them what I would expect of myself, or what I know that I can deliver. And so I think communication is a really good example for me. So I tend to lean really into very direct, open communication. And I expect that of other people. And that's not everyone's specific style of communicating. And so that's been a bit, and I expect that, I think, from any leadership that I have as well. But learning, it's not, doesn't need to be the baseline, or this doesn't need to be where I'm getting everyone else to. And when can I adapt to understand where everyone else is at and meet their needs, or understand what your communication style is. And maybe you'd like to have a softer conversation on the side instead of having it in our team meeting every day. And so, that's been a big thing for me too. And I think something that I need to probably tap into a little bit more in recognizing.
Yeah, it's a learning curve of learning to meet people where they're at, right? And that starts, of course, with really seeing them, hearing them, seeking to understand before we seek to be understood, and really putting ourselves in the perspective of another person, which we can make a lot of assumptions, right, based on our own experience. But to really, and I think that's where, as a journalist, right, you learn how to interview people, and you learn how to ask the questions, and you learn how to listen and how to tell a story from someone else's perspective. So I've never really made that connection, but I would imagine that journalism actually would be pretty helpful in some aspects of leadership.
Yeah, I actually hadn't thought about that either, but it rings very true.
Yeah.
And I think the funny part about that is that interviewing is so intentional. And I think it's a total art in and of itself. And I would never interview two people the same way.
Right.
The interview is completely designed for them and in a way to approach them, to meet them where they're at. And that's a great concept to apply to the rest of our work. And
There we go. Parlay
but
skills from one domain and apply them in another, right?
Yeah.
That's a great way to evolve, right? When we can take something we know in one domain and we can apply it in a different situation differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for listeners, I just want to call out, a lot of what we're talking about, if you want a practical tool on different leadership styles, if you just search for situational leadership or the situational leadership model, it gives kind of 4 different types of leadership, 4 different approaches, and they're based on really the competence of each of the team members, but then also the motivation of the team member. So if someone has a lot of skill and they're also highly motivated, you're going to typically be able to take a different leadership approach than if they're maybe highly motivated but don't have a lot of skill, or they have a lot of skill and they're not motivated, right? All sorts of combinations. And so it really gives some great kind of high-level descriptions of when do we need to be in a coaching role? When do we need to just delegate to people? When do we need to direct? And when do we need to support? And breaks those out, talks through those. So I think that's helpful. And just for me to kind of jump in the conversation, like for me, the directing role has been like, I'm still on the journey. Like, how do I get direct? Because like you guys, like I didn't want ever to be directed. I was highly motivated, usually pretty highly skilled in most of my roles. And so I did not want to be directed. I wanted to figure out how I did, how I met the goal that I was presented. But some people really do need to be directed and they want to be directed. And so for me, like taking a directive approach, I have to learn how to get there faster and not experience pain before I make myself go there.
It's interesting because that was the example that I shared earlier. That was the disconnect, right? Because autonomy ranks really high as one of my values, and social needs. We all have social needs that we talked about on the podcast. There's, the SCARF model, which says that, the 5 things that we all really need, and also that are the things that we get threatened on, that we feel threat if they're not met, is status, certainty, autonomy, fairness, and relatedness. Relatedness and fairness. SCARF. I put them out of order.
Scaffer.
I can't spell.
In Norwegian, it's scaffer. Right?
Sure.
Must be.
No one knows, so just say yes.
So shuffle the letters, it spells scarf if you put it in a certain order. They're not ranked. But, so because autonomy is so important to me, and I'm like you, like I like to know the vision and understand what we're trying to achieve, and then I will find a way to do it, and I will find a way to do it my way and in a way that is authentic to me, that I can connect with. That's when I show up and do my best work. You tell me how to do my job. Now, there are different levels of that, right? We're learning to do something and we need instruction and things like that, right? But I personally prefer a less directive style, right? And I had a team member who had a high need for certainty, which is one of my lowest needs, and wanted a much more directive approach and wanted clear direction. And I'm not afraid to communicate directly. I'd rather just say it like it is and have a conversation. But this team member and I could never felt like we were in sync. Right? We were speaking two different languages, like we were on two different planets. The team member was super intelligent, extremely capable, did really good work. And I just, as a new leader in that role, struggled to figure out how to connect, right? And it wasn't until later I learned about SCARF and those different needs and was able to kind of retroactively think about what I could have done differently in that situation.
So I'm curious, so you've had a year kind of in this leadership role, during a pretty exciting time. I'll put a positive spin on things, right? It's been really dynamic, and we're all having to learn a lot and be adaptive. I'm curious if you were going to talk to a manager, a director, maybe a founder, CEO, owner, who is experiencing what a lot of people are experiencing right now, which is lots of turnover, lots of people who are in supervisory roles that maybe have never been before. What from your perspective would you say, hey, these 2 or 3 things are what those folks need to be able to perform at their best in those roles?
I think the first thing is to identify the passion in that role. And, you mentioned earlier the personal why. And I think that's so key to finding that personal fulfillment. And when we're passionate about something, we're invested in something. And that's when I know I'm at my best and I'm serving my community or my team members the best. And when I see my team members are passionate about something, that's when they're doing their best work, is when they're passionate. And so I think that's the biggest thing right now. And I think there's just been, it's been sort of a roller coaster. And so it's hard to characterize the last few years one way. But when we're so exhausted from dealing with all of this change and uncertainty or whatever it may be, we kind of dip into apathy. And so it's really easy to step into a role at work or relationship or whatever it may be and just sort of float through it when we're in that space. And I think if there was a graph that shows how that goes, the more you dip into that space, your contribution to whatever space you're in dips too. And so I think that's super key. And it might be one of the hardest things to do right now is to re-energize and find that why and answer that question and buy into it. But I think that's number one.
That's interesting because when we talk about it with the word discretionary effort. And so, there's a line of performance that is like threshold effort.
Minimum effort to not get fired.
Right. Or to do like an okay job, or whatever. And then way above that is some sort of level of discretionary effort that people can give a little bit over the threshold or they can give a lot over the threshold. But the thing that drives that, there's a few things. The relationship with their team, having the tools they need, all of that good stuff. But a big one is what I value is also valued by this organization. My personal purpose is supported and I can directly fulfill it by doing this work here. So I just wanted to, that's another way to think about it. So tapping into that purpose. And I know you have a couple more examples of things to tell that manager or director, but I just want to follow a tangent. I'd love to hear about your personal why, how you've been thinking about that. Has it been evolving? Like, what is that North Star, that reason you get out of bed in the morning?
Yeah. I think it's such an exciting thing for me to think about in this time in my career and my life that I'm in, because I'm realizing, without ever having named it, that's what's driving all of these decisions for me. And when I'm not really connected with what that why is, that's when I've kind of found myself a little bit off course maybe, or disconnected from myself. And so I think for me, it always really started with that idea of service. And that was something that I would have been surrounded with my whole life in small ways and in very big ways. And so I think everyone in my family is really oriented that way, even if it's just with personal relationships. And I'm surrounded by a lot of caregivers in my life. And as an older sibling too, I've really taken on that role. And so it was always, how can I contribute back? And I think anyone who's from a small community, because that's what I can speak to, might connect with that a little bit. And even living in Missoula, a little bit bigger than Big Sky, I felt like the community was always at its best when, everyone's putting something in and then everyone gets to draw something out. And it's just this reciprocal community relationship. And so I think it really started for me at a younger age with that concept without ever realizing it and knowing that I wanted to be really driven by that. And how I found application in that was through story. And so my particular, avenue of story is journalism. It's funny, I was in Missoula recently talking to some old professors, and they're really trying to drive the idea of pushing younger people towards storytelling as opposed to journalism. And journalism's become kind of this, either it's stale or it's really controversial. Either way, not a lot of people are moving towards that space. You don't have a lot of 16-year-olds who are like, I want to be a journalist. And so really looking at this concept of storytelling. And, I was thinking about this conversation last night, and I had the book Sapiens by my bed. I love Sapiens, and a lot of people have read it. Yeah. And for anyone who hasn't read it, the tagline's sort of a brief history of humankind, and it really looks at the Homo sapiens species specifically from, conception to where we're at now. And one of the author's kind of underlying theories in that whole book is that what's allowed Homo sapiens to excel as a species and to rise, in different hierarchical chains so quickly compared to others has been story, and has been the use of story. So wrapped up into that, is language, communication, news, information, whatever it is.
And the ability to conceptualize what's in someone else's head, right?
Right.
To actually kind of read minds, but to have this or to make up stories, right? There's a ton of examples in the book of, for example, currency. It's only a thing because we all agree to believe that it's the thing.
Yeah, the buy-in to myths and to create something that doesn't physically exist is a really wild. It's something that drives. It's completely, defined our culture, and it's accelerated our species, and it's something that I think we take for granted because it's so intrinsic in our way of being. And it's also so foundational, and it's so informative to culture, to community, to everything. And it's because it's our tool for connecting with other people. And that connection then drives collaboration and growth and all these things that, make us what we are and who we are. And that really defines, who we are as smaller communities too, I think. So I think Big Sky is a really great example. And looking at how story has informed, how story has created Big Sky, a physical, community, and then in a less physical sense too. And so I've been really drawn to, these are my strengths, I think is the first part of that, is that I communicate well, I write well. That's my space, and that's how I can contribute back to that service. And then really understanding the power of that tool that I've kind of chosen as my, way of contributing. And I think that's just been huge. I think story is super important, and I feel really grateful that that's the work that I get to be a part of.
And it's such an important leadership skill, right? Communication in general, but especially storytelling, right? Because it is, like you said, it's how we connect with each other. It's how we share experiences. It's how we make meaning. And for a leader to be able to paint the picture, tell the story, for people to really connect with a vision of where an organization is going, right? What is our purpose? How do we tell the story of who we are and why we are here, why we matter? That's what makes people excited to come work for a place, right? If they can see that vision. And one of the most powerful tools we have to communicate that is through storytelling, both writing and verbally telling stories like we're doing here, which is also in our human DNA. That is the first way that we ever shared information was through sharing stories verbally. And that means that's also how our brains are wired to take in information. We're not very good at remembering linear facts and figures. We're very good at picking up on a storyline and a plot line and connecting with that and remembering a story. So to communicate important truth, if we can do it in the form of a story, whether it's fact or fiction, it actually helps us learn and connect with the message in a very different way, even from a neurological perspective. Yeah.
And I kind of think of it as like we're living in our own individual bubble. And inside of that is our floating, lived experiences or memories, which can be different. We talked about that. And then outside of that, you have these other bubbles that grow and they push you further and further into connection with, the world beyond and people beyond. And I think story, in a really broad sense, I think the stories that I tell is one really small part of what story really is. And that stories are the door into each bubble as you kind of move out from your own lived experience. And so it's what allows us to connect with everything beyond ourselves.
Yeah, that's such a great way to think about it.
Yeah. And for leaders who are listening, I think a takeaway here, as we talk about storytelling, is that when new team members are onboarded into our organization, or when someone moves into a leadership role for the first time, we have a opportunity to tell the story that's going to define how they interact with our company. The same thing goes for customers. But I think just to stick on, team members, employees, like we get to share what are the values that we have here? What are the way we solve problems here? What's the why that brings us all together? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? What's the positive outcome that our work produces in the world and community around us? These are all parts of a story that we can tell. And the best leaders have real clarity around, here's the story, and not just here's the story, but like you get a role in the story. Everyone is the hero of their own story, maybe until we've become totally self-realized, whatever. I don't know. Maybe eventually it'll be a monk who, isn't self-centered, but most people are the center of their own stories. And so not only do we say, this is the story of what you're entering into as you become part of this team, here's the character that you are. Here's how you are a hero here. Here's how your work produces outcomes that matter and make a difference. And so maybe just to make that tangible and actionable, I think that would be a really great reflection activity for leaders, is just block off 20 minutes and think through what's the accidental story that we're telling as people enter our organization or maybe move into a leadership role. And okay, great. get that on paper, and then, okay, what's the opportunity? What story could we be telling? I think you would probably come up with some pretty interesting and valuable things if you do that activity. Okay, so that was your first answer to what would you tell
Yeah, bring me back to the question.
Right.
Yes.
So the question is, okay, what would you say to director, manager, owner, founder about what are the 2 or 3 things that they need to outfit a new leader with, or that they need to provide a new leader? So first you said tap into their passion, and then we talked for like 20 minutes.
The big,
okay.
big tangent.
So what else
passion.
comes to mind?
I think, related, and I think a lot connected to what you were just talking about, Luke, is buy-in. And I think it's, a little bit of a step away from passion, but I think seeing, you said it in a great way, like talking about how they can see themselves in this story. And I think that we talk about that on my team all the time. How do we this is hard work that we're doing, and it can be really draining. And I think a lot of people can relate to that in whatever space you're in. But how do I feel like what I'm doing, and, those late nights or long hours in front of a computer screen or whatever it may be, how do I know that that's worth it? Not just for me and my passion, but for this greater purpose that we're trying to serve. And I think that's such a great tool to give people to think about, how are you in this story and what role are you playing in this story? And I think, buy-in and the underlying piece of that is confidence. So understanding why this particular person is in this role and why they're the right person to serve in that role. And I think a lot of that confidence can come from the way that I've been able to find it in my own role, and how I've tried to share that with other folks, is giving them space to a little, within reason, a little bit of wiggle room to make that role their own. So, I mentioned before, there's a lot of things that I've found in this last year that I'm not super strong at. So how can I, stretch this role a little bit this way to create space for things that maybe weren't a part of that original role, but that are ways that I can really contribute to this team and to this work, and then give me a little bit more forgiveness in those other areas. So I'm really invested, because this role isn't just this like managing editor or associate editor or whatever we are. It's not this cookie cutter thing that I'm stepping into. It's something that was made for me, and that I was chosen for, and that I can make my own. And so I can be bought into that work.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the second one.
Yeah. And when I hear buy-in and confidence, I think about, okay, what's the difference between these two stories? Hey, welcome to the story. Your job is to go to a faraway land and kill the dragon, right? Okay, great. Like I have a journey ahead of me. I can start to imagine that. How different is that though from, hey, welcome to the story. Your job is to go to a faraway land, kill the dragon, and here is this enchanted sword that provides protection and will cut through dragon armor, like a hot knife through butter. Is that the saying? So, this idea,
your magic sword,
right,
will help you do your job.
It provides a pathway. And so what I'm saying is like tools and training. And that could be like, that's why offices have coffee machines in them. Like we're asking you to come and focus and get here at a certain time. Here's a tool to help you do that. Here's your workspace. Here's a computer. Here are the keys to your vehicle. You're going to be out on the road. Here is your tool set. Here is the training course on how to use this, new set of nail gun that we got you, right? These things now make, buy-in possible, because I have what I need. I have a clear path and clear tools to be able to execute on what I'm asked to do. And so if I was going to make that an activity for a leader, I would think through, for someone to be successful in the role that we're asking them to play, what are the tools that they need? Could be physical tools, could be training, could be space, could be experiences, right? So what do they need to be successful? And then, how are we scoring? Are we giving them 20% of what they need? Are we giving them 0%? Just like, well, go figure it out. Or are we really saying, hey, here's this whole tool chest, and please let me know if there's anything in here that you haven't used before that doesn't make sense.
And I think there's a connection to be made there too with what Hannah had mentioned earlier, in the way that we think about, what tools does this person need, and how am I making that a different conversation than what tools would I need in that position? And so that's, something else that I've learned in a hurdle. But in that approach to what does this person need, it's not subconsciously, inserting yourself into that position and thinking, well, I don't need a lot of coffee because I don't drink coffee. That's definitely not true for everyone. It's not true for me.
Yeah. So
how can I invite them also into that process of thinking about what tools they need in an appropriate way? I think that's a huge part of that too.
Yeah.
Right.
Anything else that you would say, hey, this is the thing that this new leader needs to be successful?
I think a little bit of room for error. And I think that space and how much room that is really depends on the position. And sometimes people are working in spaces where mistakes are a lot more catastrophic than others. And so what that room looks like can be different, but some kind of space to learn and to grow into that role. And I think really recognizing no matter what your training is or your experience, no one's going to be 100% prepared to hit the ground completely running in any space, because the culture is different in different jobs, no matter what it is, or relationships or expectations or management. And so allowing for some forgiveness and some room to make mistakes, and then understanding where that threshold is when those mistakes need to start transitioning towards learning.
Yeah. And even having clarity on what are the non-negotiables where we can't make a mistake.
Right.
And what are the areas where, no big deal. Like every time we make a mistake, it's an opportunity to learn. There's usually a line somewhere, but it's really hard for people to figure out where it is. I was talking with a leader the other day who had spent a lot of time in the military and then in law enforcement, and now they are leading a department.
Yeah. And
they're saying, all I've known is this is the way we do it. Here's the standard operating procedure. We don't deviate. And it's a big deal if you ever deviate from it. And I was like, well, yeah, of course. Because in a military context, like, people die if you, don't use the right formation when you're clearing a building, or whatever it is. But as you're leading a department, probably not same standard for every single mistake. Probably not the same for like how we hang our keys up, or whatever it is. So getting clarity on, okay, these are the things that I can really use as coaching opportunities as we figure out what are some different ways we can do it. We can give people freedom to figure out new ways to do it. And then what are the things that, like, no, these are kind of, if we mess this up, we're all in trouble.
Yeah.
Right. And with those non-negotiables, here's a few extra tools for that particular task or that space to make sure that you're able to achieve that at the expectation that I'm setting.
Right. I mean, and so I'm just going to make this up, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but in media, publishing, journalism, there's a drop dead date that it has to go to the printer. And it has to be proofed 100% before it goes to the printer. And so I would imagine that there's some pretty high expectation around, okay, I need to know 48 hours out if you think you're at risk and might need my help to hit that deadline. It's not a afternoon before deadline, hey, I need 3 people to help me finish this type thing. So, I mean, identifying where those exist and what they are, and then being really clear about it, I think is helpful for leaders.
Yeah. And I think there's a little bit of play in that. Deadlines are a great example. Deadlines drive our life in media, especially, still being in the print business too. We print a magazine and we print a paper every other week. So it's huge. And understanding with, as a manager and in that communication, what are the deadlines that really are so critical, and what are the other tiers below that, and how am I going to communicate that? Am I going to, like, you know, we all know that maybe if I don't hit this deadline, it's not going to be great, but it's going to be okay. Is that still the communication, though, that's provided?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's, you know, different for every person. If one of the tools that they need is a little bit more of a push or is a tighter expectation, then I'm going to treat it the same as a more critical deadline.
Yeah. All right, Bella, this has been such an awesome conversation, and we could just keep talking for days. We love talking about leadership and leadership practices and community and story, and just, you know, the way you kind of weave all of those things together in what you do, I think is really inspiring and fascinating. And so as we kind of start to wrap up, why does it matter? Why does it all matter? Why does it matter to tell stories, to report accurately, to connect with community? What are the kind of bigger whys?
Yeah, I think working in Big Sky has provided a really great path towards that why and a little bit of clarity around it for me. And I think a lot of it goes back to that connection and having a real clear identity of who and what I'm serving in work. And so I think local news is a really great example of being able to identify that, because we're out in the community every day seeing the people that our work impacts. And so I think information is so critical, and, you know, at its best, story, news, whatever you want to call it, is a force of connection. And I think it can be, you know, misconstrued a lot of times, especially recently, as a tool of division. But I think local journalism is a really great example of how it can be used as a force of connection. And so I think, you know, in a community or any context that's experiencing a lot of change and a lot of maybe discomfort with that change, it's so important to have sources of information, story, news that you can trust and that you can be anchored in and that you can connect with other people on. And so I think just stepping outside our office, we're right in the middle of our community, and seeing people who are picking up our papers or getting emails, even, you know, in that more remote space, of people who are responding or asking questions about our daily newsletter. I think that really answers that bigger question.
Awesome. So Bella, if people want to learn more, if they want to read your stories, connect with you or with Outlaw in some way, what are some good ways to connect?
Yeah, I think the first way is picking up a publication. So we have newspapers that are circulated in Southwest Montana, and those are, as I mentioned, every other week. And then we have a digital presence as well that's a lot more frequent. We have daily digital news.
And what's the website that you can sign up for?
That's explorebigsky.com.
Okay.
And then our other publication, you guys might have talked about it with Eric, is Mountain Outlaw. I'm super biased, but it's an incredible publication.
It's a beautiful print magazine, beautiful both aesthetically, in the design and layouts and imagery, and the stories that you guys tell in the magazine. So I'm a little biased too, but I would highly recommend it.
So we're just preparing our summer issue right now. And the website for that, for people not in the area, is mtoutlaw.com.
Okay. So they can sign up to subscribe to the magazine, whether they're in Montana or just interested in stories from the mountains or the Montana area. Awesome. Anything else you want to share before we close?
I don't think so. I just really enjoyed this conversation with you both, and it's great I think it's always nice to have a little bit of perspective and to hear, you know, from people who are removed on leadership and management, and more specifically, you know, what I do. So it was a real pleasure to talk to you guys.
Awesome. All
Yeah.
right, Luke, how can folks connect with us?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, Bella. It's been a great time. And for anyone listening, if you want to talk to us, we help courageous leaders clarify their purpose and operationalize that across their organization. We do coaching. We do leadership training. We implement leadership cultures inside organizations, whether that's looking at onboarding, first-time supervisor training, and executive leadership training. So interested in any of that, you can see us at purposeandperformancegroup.com or really on most of the social channels. So
Awesome. Bella, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Luke and Hannah.
All right.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratteroo, and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music, and this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.